The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside High School's brick facade as students streamed through the main entrance for the first day of the spring semester. Among them was 15-year-old Amara Richardson, her dark curly hair neatly pulled back into a bun, wearing a crisp blue sweater and carrying a new backpack filled with fresh notebooks and carefully organized supplies. Amara took a deep breath as she studied her schedule. She had transferred from her previous school in Atlanta after her father, Dr. Marcus Richardson, accepted the position as Riverside High's new principal. However, they had jointly decided to keep their relationship private initially, allowing Amara to establish herself on her own merits. "You'll do great, sweetie," Dr. Richardson had told her that morning. "Just be yourself." He had dropped her off 2 blocks away, understanding her desire to walk in like any other student. Meanwhile, in room 210, Ms. Karen Walsh was arranging her desk with mechanical precision, her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she reviewed the class roster for her advanced English literature course. 20 years of teaching had cemented her particular views about academic standards, and she took pride in running what she considered a traditional classroom. The teacher's eyes narrowed as she noticed several new names on her list. The district's recent push for diversity and inclusion had, in her opinion, resulted in lowering the bar for advanced placement courses. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly, straightening the already perfectly aligned stack of syllabi on her desk. When the first bell rang, students began filing into Ms. Walsh's classroom. She observed them with her usual critical eye, mentally categorizing each one. Her gaze lingered particularly long on Amara, who had chosen a seat in the second row, carefully placing her notebook and copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on her desk. "Welcome to Advanced English Literature," Ms. Walsh announced, her voice carrying the clipped tones of someone who expected immediate attention. "I maintain very high standards in this classroom. Some of you may find the pace challenging." Her eyes swept meaningfully across certain students, posing briefly on Amara. As Ms. Walsh began reviewing the syllabus, Amara diligently took notes, unaware of the teacher's subtle scrutiny. When Ms. Walsh asked the class about their previous reading experiences, Amara's hand was among the first to rise. Ms. Walsh's eyes skipped past her raised hand. "Yes, Emily," she called on a blonde girl in the back row instead. This pattern repeated several times throughout the class. Each time Amara raised her hand, Ms. Walsh deliberately chose other students. When Amara finally managed to contribute to the discussion about symbolism in literature, Ms. Walsh's response was notably curt. "That's one interpretation," she said dismissively, quickly moving on without the encouraging elaboration she had offered other students. Down the hall in the principal's office, Dr. Richardson was settling into his new role, reviewing staff files and meeting with department heads. A framed photo of Amara sat on his desk, though he had positioned it slightly away from immediate view of visitors. He believed in letting his daughter forge her own path, but he couldn't help feeling proud of her resilience and intelligence. As the class period neared its end, Ms. Walsh assigned the first homework reading. "I expect detailed analysis, not surface-level observations," she announced, her gaze once again drifting meaningfully toward certain students. "Those who can't maintain the pace might want to consider regular English classes instead." Amara wrote down the assignment carefully, maintaining her composure despite the growing discomfort she felt under Ms. Walsh's scrutiny. Years of being one of the few black students in advanced classes had taught her to remain focused despite such subtle antagonism. When the bell rang, Ms. Walsh called out, "Miss Richardson, a moment please." Amara approached the desk, her posture straight and confident despite her internal nervousness. "I noticed you transferred from Atlanta Public Schools," Ms. Walsh said, her tone carrying a hint of condescension. "Our academic standards here might be different from what you're used to. Don't hesitate to request a transfer if you find yourself struggling to keep up." "Thank you for your concern, Ms. Walsh," Amara replied politely, her voice steady. "But I'm sure I'll manage just fine." As Amara left the classroom, she couldn't have known that this exchange was just the beginning of what would become a significant turning point, not only in her life, but in the entire culture of Riverside High School. 2 weeks into the semester, the pattern in Ms. Walsh's advanced English literature class had become unmistakable. Every time Amara raised her hand, which was often, the teacher would scan the room as if she were invisible. When Amara did manage to contribute, Ms. Walsh would quickly dismiss her comments or find subtle ways to undermine them. On this particular Tuesday, the class was discussing The Great Gatsby. Amara sat in her usual second-row seat, her copy of the novel filled with careful annotations and sticky notes marking important passages. When Ms. Walsh asked about the symbolism of the green light, Amara's hand shot up along with several others. Let's hear from. Ms. Walsh's eyes moved past Amara for the third time that day. Jason. Jason, who hadn't even raised his hand, looked up from his phone in surprise. Ah, it's like hope and stuff. Good start. Ms. Walsh nodded encouragingly. Can anyone expand on that? Amara kept her hand raised, holding her worn copy of the book with her other hand. She had spent hours analyzing this very symbol the night before. Emma? Ms. Walsh called on another student. From the back of the room, Sophie Martinez watched this scene unfold with growing discomfort. She had noticed how the teacher treated Amara differently from the start. During group work, Sophie had discovered that Amara's insights were often the most thoughtful in class, yet Ms. Walsh seemed determined to ignore her contributions. When they were assigned partner work, Sophie deliberately chose to work with Amara. As they discussed the assignment, Amara pulled out detailed notes that showed a deep understanding of the text. These are really good, Sophie whispered. You should share these in class. Amara gave a small smile. I've been trying. Their conversation was interrupted by Ms. Walsh's sharp voice. Less chatting, more analyzing, ladies. She stood over their desks, her expression particularly stern as she looked at Amara. Some of us need to focus more on comprehension than socialization. Later that day, when the class turned in their homework essays, Ms. Walsh made a show of frowning as she read Amara's paper right at her desk. Miss Richardson, please see me after class. When the bell rang and other students filed out, Amara approached Ms. Walsh's desk, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. This essay, Ms. Walsh began, holding Amara's paper like it was something distasteful, seems suspiciously well written. Are you certain this is entirely your own work? Amara felt her cheeks grow warm, but her voice remained steady. Yes, Ms. Walsh. Every word is mine. I can explain my analysis if you'd like. That won't be necessary. Ms. Walsh cut her off. I'm simply concerned that you might be overshooting your capabilities. Perhaps you should focus on writing more, appropriately for your level. In the hallway, Sophie had lingered near the door, overhearing everything. She wasn't the only one. Other students had noticed Ms. Walsh's behavior too, but most stayed quiet, unsure what to do. During lunch period, Sophie found Amara sitting alone in the library, working on homework. Hey, Sophie said, sliding into the chair across from her. What happened with Ms. Walsh wasn't right. Amara looked up, surprised by the support. I'm used to it, she said quietly. It's not the first time I've had a teacher who... She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. I just need to work harder. No, Sophie insisted. You shouldn't have to work harder just because. She paused, then lowered her voice. Have you told anyone? Like the principal or something? A complicated expression crossed Amara's face. If only Sophie knew that the principal was her father. But Amara wasn't ready for that information to become public knowledge. She wanted to handle this situation on her own merit. I'm documenting everything, Amara finally said, pulling out a small notebook where she'd been recording dates, times, and specific incidents. If it gets worse, I'll have evidence. As they talked, neither girl noticed Ms. Walsh watching them through the library window, her expression darkening at their friendship. The teacher had already decided that Amara was a threat to her carefully maintained classroom hierarchy, and she was determined to prove her point, one way or another. The autumn leaves were beginning to fall outside the classroom windows of Riverside High as tensions in Ms. Walsh's advanced English literature class reached a boiling point. 3 months into the semester, her treatment of Amara had grown increasingly obvious to everyone. That morning, Ms. Walsh was returning graded essays on The Scarlet Letter. She moved through the rows, placing papers face down on students' desks. When she reached Amara's desk, she paused deliberately. Miss Richardson, she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, I'm afraid your analysis continues to fall short of our standards. She placed the paper down, revealing a glaring C, marked in red ink. Amara stared at her essay in disbelief. She had spent hours on this assignment, carefully crafting each paragraph. Her previous English teachers had always praised her analytical skills. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed Ms. Walsh had marked her citations as incorrect, despite following the proper format, and had written unclear reasoning next to perfectly coherent arguments. Sophie, sitting 2 rows behind, felt her stomach tighten as she watched. She had read Amara's rough draft during their study session. It had been excellent. Meanwhile, her own paper, which Amara had helped her improve, received an A. During the class discussion that followed, Ms. Walsh's bias became even more apparent. When discussing the symbolism of shame in the novel, she repeatedly cut off Amara's responses. Perhaps, Ms. Walsh interrupted Amara's thoughtful analysis about societal judgment. We should hear from students who can articulate their thoughts more coherently. Her emphasis on the last word made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Later that day, during group work, Ms. Walsh overheard Amara explaining a complex theme to her classmates. The teacher's heels clicked sharply across the floor as she approached their group. "Miss Richardson," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I couldn't help but notice you're dominating the conversation. Let's remember that certain students might be better served by listening rather than leading." The other students in the group exchanged uneasy glances. Tyler, a quiet boy who rarely spoke up, found himself whispering to his friend after class, "Did you see how she treats Amara? It's not right." In the privacy of the girls' bathroom during lunch, Amara carefully documented the morning's events in her notebook. The pages were now filled with detailed accounts, dates, times, specific quotes, and witnesses. She had even started taking photos of her graded work, noticing the stark difference between Ms. Walsh's feedback to her and to other students. Sophie found her there, adding to her records. "You can't keep letting this happen," she said, sitting next to her friend on the covered radiator. "Everyone can see what she's doing." Amara sighed, closing her notebook. "I know, but I need to be strategic about this. One wrong move, and she'll just say I'm being oversensitive or causing trouble." What neither girl knew was that word of Ms. Walsh's behavior had started spreading beyond their classroom. Other teachers had noticed the tension during faculty meetings when Ms. Walsh would make thinly veiled comments about maintaining standards while discussing certain students. That afternoon, during the final period, Ms. Walsh's actions reached a new level. As she lectured about the importance of proper English, she used Amara's latest homework assignment as an example of how not to write. "Notice the informal language choices," she said, projecting Amara's paper on the screen without hiding her name. "This kind of writing might be acceptable in some contexts, but not in an advanced placement class." The students watched as she systematically tore apart Amara's work, highlighting perfectly good sentences as problematic. Amara sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calm, even as her hands trembled slightly under her desk. After class, 3 different students approached Amara in the hallway, offering to back up her documentation with their own accounts of what they'd witnessed. The support touched her deeply, but it also made her realize that the situation had grown beyond her initial plan to handle it quietly. That evening, as she added the day's events to her notebook, Amara made a decision. Tomorrow, she would finally tell her father what was happening in room 210. Ms. Walsh had no idea that her campaign of subtle discrimination was about to backfire spectacularly. It was during the unit on African American literature that everything finally came to a head in Ms. Walsh's advanced English class. The tension in room 210 was palpable as students filed in, noting the tight expression on their teacher's face as she wrote Langston Hughes' poetry analysis on the whiteboard. Today, Ms. Walsh announced with barely concealed disdain, we're required to cover some alternative perspectives in literature. She emphasized the word required as if it were distasteful, though personally, I believe we could better spend our time studying more traditional classical works. Amara sat straighter in her chair, her copy of Hughes' poetry collection already marked with detailed annotations. This was literature she had grown up with, stories and verses that spoke to her soul. Around her, several students glanced her way, knowing what was likely coming. "Let's begin with I, too, Sing America," Ms. Walsh said, her tone dismissive. "Though I must say, the grammar is rather informal." She paused, looking directly at Amara. "Perhaps that's why some students struggle with proper English structure. The implied message wasn't lost on anyone. Sophie, from her seat near the window, watched her friend's knuckles turn white as she gripped her desk, but Amara's face remained composed. When Ms. Walsh asked for interpretations of the poem, Amara raised her hand with unwavering determination. For once, the teacher called on her, though her smile held a challenge. Miss Richardson, since you seem so eager, please share your thoughts on this piece. Amara stood, her voice clear and strong. Hugh's poem is a powerful declaration of equality and resilience. When he writes about eating in the kitchen, he's addressing segregation, but also showing how. That's quite enough, Ms. Walsh interrupted. You're reading far too much into simple verses. This is exactly the kind of overreach I was concerned about. But for the first time, Amara didn't back down. With all due respect, Ms. Walsh, this poem is about the African American experience. It's about Miss Richardson. Ms. Walsh's voice rose sharply. Your continuous disruptions and argumentative attitude are becoming a serious problem. But you asked for our interpretation, Amara responded, still calm but firm. And as someone who has studied Hughes extensively, that's it. Ms. Walsh slammed her book on the desk. Your insistence on making everything about race, your challenging of academic authority, and your constant undermining of classroom dynamics ends now. Go to the principal's office immediately. The room fell silent. Several students had their phones out under their desks, recording the interaction. Tyler, who had been quietly supportive of Amara, was openly filming now, no longer caring if he got caught. Ms. Walsh, Amara said, gathering her belongings with deliberate care, this poem is about race. That's its entire purpose. And a reluctance to acknowledge that, along with your treatment of me all semester, says more about you than it does about my interpretation. How dared you? Ms. Walsh sputtered, her face reddening. She grabbed a referral slip, filling it out with shaking hands. Take this to Principal Richardson right now. We'll see what he has to say about your disrespectful behavior. As Amara walked toward the door, Sophie stood up. I'm going too, she announced. Everything Amara said was right, and we all know it. Sit down, Ms. Walsh ordered, but 3 more students stood up. We've watched this all semester, Tyler said quietly. It's not right. Amara looked at her classmates, touched by their support but knowing she needed to handle this herself. It's okay, she said to them. Stay here. I'll be fine. She walked out of the classroom with her head high, referral slip in hand. Behind her, she could hear Ms. Walsh trying to regain control of the class, her voice hitting that shrill note it got when she was flustered. As Amara walked down the hallway toward the principal's office, she felt a strange sense of calm. Her detailed notebook was in her bag, along with copies of every unfairly graded assignment and documentation of every incident. And she knew that behind that office door, she would find not just the principal, but her father, someone who had taught her to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. Ms. Walsh had finally pushed too far, and she had no idea that her carefully constructed world of subtle discrimination was about to come crashing down. The main office of Riverside High fell silent as Amara Richardson walked through the door, referral slip in hand. Mrs. Chen, the secretary who had kept the principal's family connection private all semester, looked up from her computer with knowing eyes. Ms. Walsh sent me to see the principal, Amara said quietly, holding up the pink slip. Mrs. Chen nodded, a gentle smile crossing her face. Go right in, dear. Dr. Richardson isn't in a meeting. Inside his office, Dr. Marcus Richardson was reviewing budget reports when he heard the soft knock. Come in, he called, not looking up immediately. When he did, the sight of his daughter standing there, clutching a referral slip and her worn notebook, made him set down his pen. Amara? He asked, concern evident in his voice. In all her years of schooling, she had never been sent to the principal's office. Dad, she began, her composure finally cracking slightly. I think it's time I told you what's been happening in Ms. Walsh's class. For the next 20 minutes, Amara methodically laid out the evidence she'd been gathering. She placed her notebook on his desk, opened to the first page of documented incidents. Then came the unfairly graded assignments, the photos of other students' papers for comparison, and finally, her phone with text messages from classmates offering to verify her accounts. Dr. Richardson listened in growing silence, his expression becoming more grave with each revelation. As a father, he felt a deep pain hearing how his daughter had been treated. As a principal, he was disturbed by the pattern of discrimination being revealed. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked softly, after she finished describing the day's incident. Amara straightened in her chair. "I wanted to handle it myself first, to make sure I had evidence, to be certain I wasn't imagining things. And," she hesitated, "I didn't want anyone thinking I got special treatment because I'm your daughter." A knock interrupted them, and Mrs. Chen poked her head in. "Dr. Richardson, I have 5 students here insisting on speaking with you. They say it's about Ms. Walsh's class." Behind her stood Sophie, Tyler, and 3 other students, all looking determined. Dr. Richardson glanced at Amara, who nodded slightly. "Send them in," he said. One by one, the students shared their observations. Tyler pulled out his phone, showing the video he'd taken of the day's incident. Sophie described the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed all semester. Each student had a different perspective, but their stories aligned perfectly with Amara's documentation. "She's been doing this all semester," Sophie explained. "We should have spoken up sooner. But we didn't know how," Tyler finished. "Until today, when she went too far." Dr. Richardson looked at the growing pile of evidence on his desk, then at the group of students standing up for what was right. His next steps as principal were clear, but first, he needed to address something else. "Amara," he said, "I'm proud of how you handled this. You documented everything, stayed professional, and didn't let it affect your work. But as your father, I wish you hadn't had to go through it alone." The other students' eyes widened as they processed his words. "Wait," Tyler said, looking between Amara and Dr. Richardson. "You're his daughter?" Amara nodded. "We kept it quiet. I wanted to prove myself on my own merits." "Which makes Ms. Walsh's behavior even more concerning," Dr. Richardson added, reaching for his phone. "She'll be surprised to learn who she's been targeting." He pressed the intercom button. "Mrs. Chen, please call Ms. Walsh to my office immediately, and contact the school board. We'll need an emergency meeting this afternoon." As the students left his office, each one promised to provide written statements. Amara stayed behind, finally letting her shoulders relax. "What happens now?" she asked. Dr. Richardson looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and determination. "Now, we make sure this never happens to another student again. Ms. Walsh is about to learn some very important lessons about prejudice, professionalism, and the consequences of underestimating my daughter." As if on cue, they heard Mrs. Chen's voice through the intercom. "Ms. Walsh is on her way, Dr. Richardson." Father and daughter shared a look, knowing that the next few moments would change Riverside High forever. Ms. Walsh strode into the principal's office with the confident air of someone who expected to be proven right. That confidence faltered slightly when she saw Amara sitting beside Dr. Richardson's desk, surrounded by carefully organized stacks of papers. "Dr. Richardson," Ms. Walsh began, smoothing her skirt as she sat down, "I'm glad you called me. Miss Richardson's behavior today was completely unacceptable. Her disruption of class and challenge to my authority." "Ms. Walsh," Dr. Richardson interrupted quietly, "before you continue, I think there's something you should know." He placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "This is my daughter." The color drained from Ms. Walsh's face as she looked between them, finally noticing the resemblance. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "Your daughter?" But she never said. "She shouldn't have had to," Dr. Richardson replied. "Every student deserves fair treatment, regardless of who their parents are, or, more importantly, regardless of their race." Over the next hour, Dr. Richardson methodically went through the evidence. He played Tyler's video from that morning's class. He showed the comparative grade analysis that revealed the stark differences in how Ms. Walsh evaluated Amara's work versus other students. He read from Amara's detailed documentation of 3 months of subtle discrimination. Ms. Walsh's attempts at defense grew increasingly desperate. "You're misunderstanding my teaching methods," she protested. "I have high standards for all my students." "Is that why Jason's paper with 3 grammatical errors received an A, while Amara's error-free paper got a C?" Dr. Richardson asked, laying both essays side by side. By late afternoon, the school board had convened an emergency meeting. 5 members sat around the conference table, reviewing the evidence while Ms. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Board member Mrs. Thompson, a former civil rights attorney, looked particularly troubled as she read through Amara's notebook. "This pattern is disturbingly clear," she said, "but what concerns me more is that it might not be isolated." At her suggestion, the board began pulling Ms. Walsh's records from previous years. They found similar complaints buried in her file, concerns that had been dismissed or overlooked by the previous administration. Former students were contacted. One by one, they shared similar stories. Marcus Chen, now a college sophomore, described how Ms. Walsh had discouraged him from applying to top universities. Maria Rodriguez, currently a senior, revealed she had dropped from advanced to regular English after weeks of subtle undermining from Ms. Walsh. The investigation expanded beyond just Ms. Walsh's classroom. The board examined overall grading patterns, advanced placement demographics, and student feedback across the school. "This goes deeper than one teacher," Dr. Richardson explained to the board. "We need systematic changes to prevent this from happening again." While the investigation continued, Ms. Walsh was placed on administrative leave. She left the school that evening, her face tight with anger, still insisting she had done nothing wrong. In the empty hallway after the board meeting, Amara found her father staring out the window at the setting sun. "Dad," she said softly, "are you okay?" He turned to her with tired eyes. "I keep thinking about all the students before you who went through this alone, who didn't have the support or means to document everything like you did." Amara nodded. "That's why we need to fix the system, not just remove one teacher." Dr. Richardson smiled proudly at his daughter's wisdom. "You're right, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Later that night, as news of the investigation spread through social media and text messages, more students began coming forward. Sophie created a private online group where students could share their experiences safely. Tyler compiled video evidence from other classes where similar subtle discrimination occurred. The investigation was revealing uncomfortable truths about Riverside High, but it was also showing the strength of its students. They were standing together, supporting each other, and demanding change. As Amara updated her notebook that evening, adding the day's events to her documentation, she realized that what had started as her personal struggle for justice had grown into something much larger. The revelation of her identity as the principal's daughter hadn't just exposed one teacher's prejudice. It had cracked open a door that would lead to fundamental changes at Riverside High. The school board hearing room was packed on a cold Monday morning. Students, parents, teachers, and community members filled every available seat, with more people standing along the walls. At the front of the room, Ms. Walsh sat with her union representative, while Dr. Richardson and the board members occupied a long table facing the audience. "This hearing will now come to order," announced Mrs. Thompson, the board's chairperson. "We're here to address serious allegations of discriminatory behavior and unfair treatment of students at Riverside High School." Over the next 3 hours, student after student came forward to testify. Each story painted a clearer picture of the systematic discrimination that had gone unchecked for years. Sophie Martinez approached the podium, her voice steady as she described what she had witnessed. "I watched Ms. Walsh dismiss Amara's contributions every single day, even though Amara often had the most insightful comments in class." Tyler followed, playing his recorded videos on the large screen. The footage clearly showed Ms. Walsh's dismissive tone and biased behavior. "This wasn't just one bad day," he explained. "This was every day." When it was Amara's turn to speak, she brought her notebook, now supplemented with statements from dozens of current and former students. She didn't speak with anger or seek revenge. Instead, she presented her evidence calmly and professionally, focusing on the need for change. "This isn't just about me," Amara stated clearly. "It's about every student who has felt diminished, discouraged, or discriminated against in our school." Ms. Walsh's defense began to crumble as more evidence mounted. When questioned about her grading practices, she couldn't explain the clear disparities in how she evaluated different students' work. Her attempts to justify her behavior only revealed deeper prejudices. "I maintain high standards," she insisted, her voice growing shrill. "If certain students can't meet those standards—" "Like this paper?" interrupted Mrs. Thompson, holding up 2 essays. The one you gave a C has fewer errors and stronger analysis than the one you gave an A. Can you explain the difference in grading? Ms. Walsh's face reddened. That's just one example. We have dozens of examples. Dr. Richardson cut in, his voice firm but controlled. The pattern is undeniable. During a brief recess, former students who had graduated years ago arrived to share their stories. Marcus Chen, now a successful college student despite Ms. Walsh's discouragement, spoke about how her actions had almost destroyed his confidence. I almost gave up on my dreams because she told me I wasn't university material, he said. I'm here to make sure no other student has to doubt themselves because of prejudiced teachers. As the evidence continued to mount, Ms. Walsh's composure finally broke. She stood up suddenly, pointing at Amara. This is all because you're the principal's daughter. You're using your privilege, Toe. Ms. Walsh, Dr. Richardson interrupted, his voice cutting through her outburst. My daughter documented your behavior long before you knew who she was. Her identity isn't the issue here. Your actions are. The board deliberated for only 30 minutes before reaching their decision. When they returned, Mrs. Thompson's expression was grave. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, the board has determined that Ms. Walsh's conduct violates multiple district policies regarding discrimination and professional conduct. Her employment with Riverside High School is terminated, effective immediately. But the board wasn't finished. They announced a comprehensive review of all school policies, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, and the creation of a student-led diversity and inclusion council. As people began filing out of the hearing room, Amara found herself surrounded by students and parents, many with tears in their eyes, thanking her for speaking up. Sophie hugged her tightly, while Tyler grinned and showed her the final video he recorded of the hearing for the school archives. Ms. Walsh left the building alone, her box of personal belongings clutched tightly to her chest. She had lost not just her job, but the reputation she'd built over 20 years of teaching. Later that evening, in Dr. Richardson's office, Amara sat with her father, both processing the day's events. You did good, kiddo, he said softly. Amara smiled tiredly. We did good, she corrected. But there's still more work to do. Dr. Richardson nodded, looking at the stack of policy documents on his desk. Yes, there is. But thanks to you, we've made a start. Real change is finally coming to Riverside High. 6 months after the hearing that changed Riverside High, the school had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The spring sunshine streamed through the windows of what used to be Ms. Walsh's classroom, now occupied by Ms. Amara sat in her usual second-row seat, but now she was co-leading a presentation to the class about diversity in literature. The walls that had once displayed only classical European authors now showcased a vibrant mix of writers from various backgrounds and cultures. And that's why we're proposing to expand our reading list, Amara concluded, gesturing to the PowerPoint slide behind her. Sophie stood beside her, operating the computer, while Tyler filmed the presentation for the school's new monthly newsletter. Ms. Rodriguez beamed at the students. Excellent work. This is exactly the kind of student initiative we want to encourage. In the hallway outside, a newly installed bulletin board displayed the Voices of Riverside section, where students shared their experiences and celebrated their diverse backgrounds. It had become one of the most popular spots in the school, with new stories added weekly. Dr. Richardson had been busy implementing the changes promised at the hearing. Mandatory sensitivity training was now required for all staff members quarterly, not just annually. A new anonymous reporting system allowed students to safely report any concerns about discrimination or unfair treatment. The Student-Led Diversity and Inclusion Council, which Amara helped establish, met weekly in the library. Today's meeting was particularly important as they reviewed the results of their first school-wide survey. The numbers show real improvement, Amara reported to the group. 78% of students say they feel more comfortable participating in class discussions now. 82% report feeling that their cultural background is respected. But we still have work to do, Sophie added, pointing to other statistics. Some students still feel marginalized, especially in advanced placement classes. Dr. Richardson, who attended these meetings as an observer rather than a leader, nodded approvingly at their thorough analysis. The council had become a powerful force for positive change in the school. The impact extended beyond Riverside's walls. Other schools in the district have begun implementing similar programs, using Riverside's new policies as a model. Local news outlets had covered the transformation, leading to speaking invitations for both Dr. Richardson and Amara. Even some of Ms. Walsh's former students had found healing through the changes. Marcus Chen, now a regular visitor, mentored students who felt discouraged about their academic prospects. Maria Rodriguez had returned to advanced English, flourishing under the new teaching approach. During lunch period, Amara sat with a diverse group of friends in the cafeteria, discussing their latest initiative, a cultural exchange program they were planning for the next semester. "Remember when we were all afraid to speak up in class?" Sophie mused, looking around at their group. "Now we can't get them to stop talking," Tyler joked, earning laughs from everyone. After school, Amara found her father in his office, reviewing applications for another new teaching position. The school was expanding its advanced placement programs, with a focus on ensuring equal access and support for all students. "How's it going, Dad?" she asked, settling into what had become her usual chair. Dr. Richardson looked up with a tired but satisfied smile. "We're making progress. The district is implementing our anonymous reporting system in all schools next month. And the scholarship program? Approved. Starting next year, we'll have special funding to support underrepresented students in advanced courses." Amara nodded, thinking about how much had changed since that first day in Ms. Walsh's class. What had started as one student's documentation of discrimination had sparked a movement for genuine institutional change. As she walked home that evening, Amara passed the school's new welcome sign, which read Riverside High School, where every voice matters in multiple languages. The setting sun cast long shadows across the words, reminding her of that first morning when she walked into school, trying to hide who she was. Now, she walked with her head high, proud of who she was and what she and her fellow students had accomplished. The story of the racist teacher and the principal's daughter hadn't ended with just one person losing their job. Instead, it had become a catalyst for lasting change, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with one person brave enough to speak up. At Riverside High, every student now knew that their voice mattered, their presence was valued, and their future was bright. And that, Amara thought as she walked home, was the most important change of all.